I can hear you,
What?
Dave.
Oh, okay.
Good morning, everybody. This is Alexis at Groundswell. Hi. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you for waiting a few minutes. I'm seeing lots of people are just kind of like coming in, and it's really awesome. But I will get started. So this is Farming for Justice with Groundswell Center for Local Food and Farming. It's our monthly discussion group for farmers and producers. And we're really excited about today and the conversations we will be having. First, at Groundswell, we start all of our workshops and events and discussions with a land acknowledgement. And so here in Ithaca, New York, where we are south of Cayuga Lake, we are at a really beautiful place in the state, which is traditional Gayokono territory. It is unceded land. I'm learning more and more about what it means to be living on this land, also what it means to be living on this land as an Indigenous person. And it's really complicated, but I do know that everything that we do here happened because there are many people that have died. There's a lot of blood that has been shed, and the history isn't so nice. So we like to bring that up because we do know that we are benefiting from genocide, but also that the Gayokono are still alive and they're still here, they're still living, they're still part of this community. And it's important to acknowledge that. And then as a map, there's a really cool website. It's called native-land.ca if you don't know about it. It's really awesome. And so when you go on, you can kind of like zoom in and out of like wherever you are on the continental, I think, North America. I'm not quite sure the scope of the website anymore, but this is kind of an idea of where we're at. And right now we are south of Ithaca, and or south of Cayuga Lake, and living on land that is part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And then also have to say that all of these programs happen at Groundswell Center because people give us their feedback. So after the end of this amazing discussion that will happen today, I will put a link in the chat box, and I will also email all of the participants. But your evaluations are really necessary, actually, for us to keep this programming going. And it takes about 5 minutes. So just know that after this is over, you'll get an email, and then I'll also post the link in the group chat for you to fill it out. And it's totally anonymous, and your feedback is really important to us. So today, for Farming for Justice, our discussion is on queering sustainable agriculture. And we're having a panel featuring Michaela Hoffelmeyer, Isaac Leslie, and Jaclyn Wypler. And I will let them introduce themselves. But one last thing before I turn it over, and I'll mention this again at the end, is after this discussion, we have an amazing communications intern right now, and so she's doing an open call. And right now we will be working to create a blog post that involves interviews with LGBTQ plus farmers across the US. So if you are one of those folks who would love to be comfortable and willing to be featured on our blog, please reach out to Maggie. Her contact information is communications@groundswellcenter.org. The article will shine a light on how sexuality shapes how and why people farm, where people farm, and how farmers access land, centering the voices of queer farmers. So if you would like to be involved and you would like to share your story, please reach out. It will be much appreciated. Otherwise, to all of you that are wondering, this discussion, this Zoom call will be recorded, and about a week after the discussion, you'll be sent a link as well. And so I will turn it over to our amazing panelists today.
Thank you so much. I'm going to start sharing my screen and then we'll get started. Okay, can you all see the screen okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, thank you again so much for having us. And our talk is titled Farming for Food Justice, Queering Sustainable Agriculture. And just to start off with some introductions, my name is Michaela, or Mick. I use she and they pronouns. I'm currently at Penn State in State College, and I'm on Susquehannock land. And I did interviews with queer farmers in the Northeastern US, and I want to thank Northeast Queer for supporting the research and really helping give me the resources and allow me to share this with a broader audience. And so what kind of brought me to this research was that I came to graduate school, I was interested in gender and sustainability, and it really felt like we were missing this sexuality aspect or queer aspect within, you know, what we're talking about in farming organizations. And then I met incredible people like Jack and Ike who have really challenged me to think more about this, and they're absolutely paving the way. And so I'm just really happy to be able to collaborate with them and share some of our findings from our interviews. So I'll let Ike introduce himself.
Hi everyone, my name is Isaac, or Ike. I use he or they pronouns. I'm currently calling in from Carandiland in Buenos Aires, Argentina. I'm a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And I have sort of two areas of research, or sort of two main tracks. One is about agroecological and certified organic food systems that span Argentina and the US. And the other is about sexuality and agriculture. So I got started in this interest in queer farming about 5 years ago. I was living and working on a small farm in rural New Hampshire, and I found it difficult to reconcile or live at the same time both my queer self and also my farming self. And so I got into this research because I wanted to know if other folks felt similarly, and also if so, what folks' strategies was for living vibrant rural queer lives.
Hi everyone, I'm Jaclyn or Jack. I use they and she pronouns. I am also a PhD candidate in sociology at UW-Madison. I'm calling in from Ho-Chunk land here in Madison, Wisconsin. And I am just stupid giddy right now seeing all of your faces. I have friends from California and from New York, so just really want to thank all of you for being here, particularly if it's currently 6 a.m. for you. I am thrilled and so excited to share this morning. So my research is ethnography on lesbian, bisexual, and queer women, as well as transgender and non-binary farmers here in the Midwest. And I've also conducted some interviews in the Pacific Northwest, and I spent 6 months with queer farmers in Australia as well. So that's the perspective that I'm going to be speaking from in my research. And how I came to this was, as an undergrad, I was in the track team and very eating disordered. And through a class, we went out and visited our college's organic farm. And I fell in love with it. I started volunteering out there and getting the CSA and growing and cooking my own food. And through that process, my tics around eating went away. And once I was eating again and feeding and nourishing my body, I realized that I was a very queer human being. So for me, food and farming and sexuality have always been very tied together, which I then worked on some farms and then started researching the intersections of those things in grad school.
So to get us started, I just want to say that what's unique about queer farmers? Queer farmers experience a lot of the same situations and challenges that all farmers face, especially things like land and labor access, tight profit margins, often needing to work an off-farm job. But sexuality also has something to do with agriculture that I think we often don't recognize or name, even though it's sort of hidden in plain sight, which is that around 98% of farms in the US and also worldwide are family farms. And so what does this mean? Well, to start, it doesn't mean that that family farming has anything necessarily to do with your production method or how sustainable you are, but rather the way we think about it is it's a way of organizing food production where your agricultural business partner is also your intimate partner. And because queer folks often have different paths in family, sometimes we have different paths in farming as well. So I want to do a quick aside and also just mention how we're using the word queer today. So when we refer to individual people, we use their preferred descriptors for their gender identity and their sexual orientation. but we use queer when we're talking about groups of people, folks who fall under the LGBTQ plus spectrum. We also understand that this approach isn't perfect and doesn't sit right with a lot of folks, so we ask your forgiveness for that in advance. And the other way we use queer, especially a little later on in the presentation, is when we're referring to a queer lens. And what we mean by that is a body of thought called queer theory specifically. So to give you a quick roadmap of this presentation, we're gonna start by giving some examples of queer farmers' experiences of oppression. Then we're gonna talk about queer farmers' experiences of resistance and strategies of resistance. And then in the third and final part of the presentation, we'll talk about how a queer theoretical lens on agriculture can tell us something about how all farms operate, especially keeping in mind the values of food justice and ecological sustainability. So I'll turn it over to Mick to get us started.
Thanks, Ike. So I want to start off today talking a little bit about farm location and where we choose to farm. So most of us, when we think of farming, we picture rural places. And this is not to discount urban farming whatsoever, but simply to note that farmland is very prevalent in rural areas and it may be more viable in these places. But when we think of queer people, we typically associate them with urban places. So we can think about neighborhoods or pride parades and how this is what we think of as queer community in these spaces. And so I just want us to think about this as we move forward. And I'm going to use a quote from Whitney, who is a white bisexual woman. And she says, "In the rural communities that we have lived, we have found people to connect with and be in community with. And yet it has also been fairly isolating and sometimes threatening. Where I farm, with who I farm, certainly influences my own sense of safety and acceptance." So from this, we can start to get at that understanding that ruralness and queerness might kind of be different things. And so Whitney is saying that, you know, as a cisgender woman and as a queer person, she's made some connections in the community, but she's still concerned about feeling safe and feeling welcomed in the community. And she moved with a partner, and so they have to navigate really carefully about how they share their relationship or how they share their identity. And so what we can take away from this is what queer scholars have called metronormativity. And metronormativity is the assumption that queer people should live in the city, that in fact there's this linear pathway from the unaccepting rural to the welcoming urban. And there is a history of this. There's the history of the Great Gay Migration in the 70s and 80s, where there was a large rural exodus of queer people to cities like San Francisco and New York. But what metronormativity can inform with and share with us is that this is an oversimplified notion, an assumption about where people should and shouldn't live. And what results of this, oversimplification is that rural queer people have traditionally been overlooked. They're not seen as present in these spaces. And so what this means for queer farmers is that they challenge both the farmer identity, which we typically think of as white heterosexual men, and they challenge the queer identity because we typically think of queer people in urban places and not working the land or in nature in rural spaces. And so queer farmers really have this additional consideration of where to farm based on queer culture and queer assumptions about acceptance. And what this means for other people, I use the example of Mason here, and they explain that based on their experiences in rural areas, if you don't conform to a certain way of small town life, it's hard to interject yourself there. It's possible, but definitely there are some times where everyone leaves each other alone, but then they gossip a lot behind your back. You might say it's violence, but you might not. But definitely everyone will give you weird looks, talk about you, and make it feel like you are unwelcome. I feel that way more than a physical threat because it's intimidating in this area. So what Mason is explaining and what we found in our research is that people have actual experiences of marginalization, of otherness in rural places, and two, other people may simply perceive this threat or this unwelcoming aspect of rural places even before they set foot on the farm. And so if we think about our sexuality as having implications for where and how we decide to work and live, we can think about other aspects of identity that also impact that as well, such as race and gender. So now I'll turn it over to Jack to talk about race and sexuality.
Thanks, Michaela. So when we're thinking about queer farmers and their experiences with oppression, a key concept to consider is intersectionality. Intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989, the year of me and Taylor Swift, and it is rooted in research and activism by women of color. So scholars like Crenshaw, Bell Hooks, and Patricia Hill Collins observed that women of color were largely absent both in feminist social movements as well as race-based social movements. So these scholars were making a call to take a deeper look at the interconnected factors that influence power, privilege, and oppression. Intersectionality is a fairly common word. Some of you may have heard it, and it's commonly used to refer to multiple identities that may experience social marginalization. So maybe being a woman and being Black and being a lesbian. But the term, as it was coined, is really tapping into these deeper power structures of oppression. So things like sexism, racism, and heterosexism. If you look at the chart, which is a little small, but hopefully you can see it, you can see that there's other forms of oppression as well, like classism, ableism, and colorism. So for queer farmers, they may be experiencing oppression from the intersections of multiple power structures as they interact with heterosexism. For the farmers of color in my research, they often identified racism as a significant source of that oppression that they faced. In my research, this became clear when I spoke to one farmer, Mo, who was a Black lesbian flower farmer in a Midwestern city. Mo previously farmed in a rural part of her state, and she described that as 4 intersections with a stop sign. When I asked Mo what it was like to be a lesbian in this community, she said that she did not hide being a lesbian, but it really wasn't known because she didn't have a relationship with her neighbors who were white. She told me, quote, "The issue for me was more around race." When I asked her to elaborate, she said, oh, I have to switch so I can actually read this on my screen. Hold on one second. Well, I mean, you know, they're like, okay, who's that Black girl? What's she doing? What? She brought a tractor? They were watching all the time. And then as people got to know me, they would drive down the driveway. So what are you doing now? You're planting flowers? Well, you can't eat flowers. What are you going to do with those? So in this, Mo is talking about feeling watched by her white neighbors and questioned when they would stop in. She later went on to describe more of what her experience was like. Michaela, next slide. Thank you. So yeah, the race was more of a thing. I felt like there was more discrimination going on. There was just more of minding my P's and Q's. You know, everybody had a gun and I did not have a gun. So what we're hearing from Mo is that living in the country as a single Black lesbian, she described racism as a more significant source of oppression than her sexuality. She felt watched by white men in her community who farmed, men who owned guns and would drive down her driveway unannounced to question her farming practices. While the white farmers in my research largely did not remark on their whiteness as facilitating their ties with their white rural communities and accepted this stop-in culture from their neighbors, stopping in and questioning take on a different cadence at the intersections of sexism and racism for Mo. The surveillance that Mo felt as a Black lesbian at these intersections was even more heightened given the white men's gun ownership and her lack thereof. Mo eventually left this rural farm in part to be closer to urban cities and communities of color, and it did eventually reopen a new farm, but this is a farm in the city. So when we're thinking about queer farmers' experiences with oppression, it's important to, yes, highlight where that may be coming from heterosexism, but also how this may interact with things like racism. So I'm going to pass off to Ike to talk about other dimensions of intersectionality that may be experiencing, that queer farmers may experience.
Yeah, so talking a little bit about gender in farming, something that the 3 of us have found in our research is that the mainstream culture of rural and agricultural spaces favors masculinity over femininity. And so what I'm referring to here is nothing to do with nature or biology, but rather these are characteristics that society deems as masculine or feminine in mainstream society. So a useful word for making sense of what we're finding is androcentrism. And this is the granting of higher status, respect, value, reward, and power to the masculine compared to the feminine. And one thing that I think is particularly interesting in what we're finding in our research is that farmers' experiences of androcentrism doesn't necessarily correlate with their sex assigned at birth, their gender identity, or their sexual orientation, not directly anyway. and it might be more tied actually to their gender expression or gender presentation. So for instance, like how we dress can communicate masculinity or femininity regardless of these other identities. And there's actually some research out there that shows that, for instance, queer cisgender women who express masculinity intentionally or not through their clothing are actually more accepted in rural areas. And what I want to offer here is a quote from Will, a cisgender gay man who I interviewed, who described how one particular experience of androcentrism affected him. So in this quote, Will is thinking back about how he just got started in farming. Will said, "I was so nervous about farmers. I was afraid that, you know, my gayness or my non-manliness, that I wouldn't be accepted on a farm. I would go to a farmer's market in hopes to talk to a farmer about how they became a farmer. Never did it. I was too scared. And I was even afraid to buy the produce, like I felt like a poser or something. And so I'd always end up leaving with a cookie or something like that, you know, something in a package." So the androcentrism and the hegemonic masculinity of this agricultural space, it slowed Will down from getting into farming and even from leaving a farmer's market, buying produce, for having to interact with farmers directly. And I think it's worth mentioning here that just because an agricultural space is sustainable or local, like the one that Will was in, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's any less androcentric. So to conclude this little section, I just want to say that queer farmers' experiences of oppression, they vary widely. They depend a lot on context, and so there's no like singular queer farmer experience. But at the same time, we do see some patterns in how queer farmers experience gender and androcentrism. As I briefly mentioned, as folks experience sexual orientation and heterosexism, as Michaela talked about, and how racism intersects with all of these identities, as Jack talked about. But I think it's really important to also be clear that for queer farmers, our queerness is not just a matter of oppression, but also can be a source of joy and community building and resistance, which I'm going to turn over to Jack to get us started talking about.
Thank you, Ike. Yeah, so we want to make sure that we're acknowledging the challenges that queer farmers face, but not making this be the limiting and the only narrative that we hear. Queer farmers also have creative ways that they're bucking norms, celebrating their identities, and creating community wherever they are, whether that be as individuals, through intentional communities, or larger organizing, which many of you are part of. And again, just so thrilled to see you on this call. So in talking to farmers in the Midwest in my research, many people shared feeling torn between their identities as farmers and their identities as queer people. This is tapping into what Michaela was talking about earlier about heteronormativity, the seemingly incompatibleness of being queer and rural farmer, for example. Sustainable farmers in these queer farmers community didn't even necessarily know that these queer farmers were queer or didn't know how to engage it. And the queer farmers' friends in the cities wouldn't understand why the farmer would have to leave watching Orange is the New Black early to go milk the goats. I then met people who had the opportunity to work for or with other queer farmers, and they shared stories of feeling so seen and validated and supported as their whole selves, as queer farmers in these roles and positions. But not all people necessarily have access to other queer farmers in their local communities. So I want to share with you the story of one person, Debbie, who is a farmer in a remote area of Australia. Debbie and I connected after she read a blog post that I wrote for the Invisible Farmer Project, which is a project based out of the Melbourne Museum to uncover and center historical and current work by Australian women in agriculture. And I had the privilege to speak with Debbie over the phone. And Debbie was telling me that at the peak of her career, she was mentoring other farmers and she earned all of her money off of her 3,000 acres in rural New South Wales. She worried about being conceited, but eventually she did tell me I was a pretty darn good farmer. Today, Debbie farms about 1/10 of that amount of land. She has 300 acres with cattle, hay, and wheat. And she lost a lot of that land in a recent divorce. Debbie's wife left her 3 years ago after Debbie, who was 60 at the time, came out as a transgender woman. Coming out not only cost Debbie her land, but left her in a precarious position to manage her drought-ridden farm alone. And she told me, yet you have no idea how much that decision, coming out as transgender, changed my life and the happiness I have found. Debbie has found largely acceptance in her local community. Farmers at the cattle auction, men in farming greet her by her name, and when she attempted to resign from boards of community organizations, worried that her presence on those boards as a trans woman would cause other people to quit, those members told her, "You're one of us and you bring value, you are staying on these boards." And she said, "You can be you as long as you're not in people's faces." Yet Debbie really lacked connection to other queer people. She had to travel about 3 hours to the nearest city to be with other queer and trans folks. So she made a way to resist and to support herself. She created a gender diversity group in her rural community that holds monthly dinners. And about 15 people, queer and trans folks, travel upwards of 150 miles to attend these monthly dinners. And this has been a really great way for Debbie to feel supported. She's not very optimistic about her dating prospects in her community, but she is still the happiest she's ever been, and she remains committed to her land. She said, "I will die on this place if I can." So we often hear about queer people who need to leave their homes, to leave their rural communities, leave farming in order to feel supported in their queerness. Debbie is an example of someone who is resisting by staying in farming, by staying in her rural community where she has spent her entire life. She did not have access to queer and trans people there, and especially not to other queer farmers. So she created this gender diversity group to bring the queers to her even once a month and provide her support and solidarity as a trans woman farmer. So Debbie is an example of this individual level of resistance. And I'm going to pass it off to Ike to discuss more intentional and group level ways to resist as queer farmers.
Thanks, Jack. So I want to start by saying that queer folks using agriculture as a form of resistance is not new. And you see this pretty visibly, especially starting in the late 60s and 70s with, for instance, the Radical Fairies, who were mostly gay men who usually temporarily communed in rural spaces, grew food, embraced drag, and embraced what folks talk about as like connecting with nature. Some of these communities were more permanent, but on the whole, not quite as permanent as the lesbian land movement, which got started around the same time and at its peak had 150 or so intentional communities. And one thing that's really remarkable about these communities is folks weren't just learning the skills to grow food, but they were also typically learning all of the traits necessary to sometimes completely live lives separate from men. So something that's really critical about this space is that it was a safe space where lesbian feminists could strategize liberation from the heteropatriarchy. So in this quote that you see here, Doris described to me how the lesbian land movement connected with her sexuality and also her choice in particular to become a sustainable farmer. So Doris is referring back to their young adulthood and said this: "I think being a little bit of a misfit gave me choices because I couldn't just follow the crowd. I didn't fit in. It took me a long time to figure out that that was my sexual orientation and my sense of self and place. So it forced me to explore options, and I feel lucky that the lesbian feminist movement coincided with my young adulthood. I couldn't follow the mainstream, so I followed my heart. That is how I think lesbianism and farming intersect in my soul." So this is an example of like queer-only spaces like this can be understood as an example of what our mentor, Dr. Monica White, calls prefigurative politics. And prefigurative politics is something you can read about in Dr. White's new book, Freedom Farmers, which is about the history of African-American farmers in the US using agriculture and collective organizing as strategies of resistance. And just to, what prefigurative politics is really about is creating spaces for groups that have been historically marginalized, where they can build solidarity with each other, and importantly, where they can be safe in order to strategize resistance together in groups. So some sort of early forms of queer agricultural prefigurative politics that we see in our research are one, queer households. So sometimes queer folks are taking the home, which may or may not be on the farm itself, and living with other queer folks, some of whom might be agricultural partners, others might be intimate partners, others just might be friends, or it might be a different combination altogether. Other times, queer folks are connecting with queer communities, either in urban spaces, going back and forth between city and country, or in online spaces to either urban or rural queer folks. And really importantly, we found that queer-run farms and queer-owned farms was a really important space, especially for beginning queer farmers to start envisioning themselves in agriculture and to get mentorship, especially in rural areas. And also for rural queer community members, consumers, in order to be connecting with other queer folks at places like farmers markets. So I'd say that in contrast to the movements of the 1970s, we're starting to see queer farmer groups and organizations embrace not just these separatist strategies, but also strategies of intervening in mainstream spaces, which I'll turn over to Michaela to talk about.
Thanks, Ike. So as we've seen, queer farmers are mobilizing and building resistance at individual and community or smaller levels that way. We're also seeing that queer farmers are organizing on broader scales. So I have several examples on the screen here that I'll talk about, but I'll feature the Northeast Queer Farmer Alliance meeting. And so this happened just last year in rural New York. A few rural queer-owned farms came together and hosted an event for anyone in the public to come and to gather and to share their experiences of what it means to be queer and working in agriculture or the food system more broadly and farming. And so what this event allowed was a variety of people. There were over 80 people there, mostly from the Northeast, but around from other places in the US. And it was a time where people could come together, meet people in person, and talk to each other. And so we also are seeing this with the Queer Farmer Convergence in Iowa, and this happens every fall, where another rural queer farmer organizes an event along with partners, and it brings people to a place on the land for a few days to talk and to meet and to collaborate with one another. And there's also the Queer Farmer Field Day in California. And so if we're thinking about how queer people are marginalized from certain learning opportunities or training opportunities, tailoring specific extension opportunities or trainings is an important way to get queer people and other types of people who are marginalized in agriculture access to these resources. So I'll highlight that in particular the Northeast Queer Farmer Alliance meeting and the Queer Farmer Convergence it's being taken on by these rural queer farmers. And so I'll point out that these are things that you can really easily Google and look up and support. They're both looking for funding right now to support their continued efforts. The Queer Farmer Convergence has a calendar that you can purchase, and the Northeast Farmer Alliance is looking to raise funds in that way. So I'd really encourage you, if you're in those areas, you can certainly look them up and try to go to those events. But if you're not in those areas, lend your support to helping these groups work. And out of these groups as well, there are online groups and other ways for queer farmers to talk and work with each other. So I've seen this, queer farmers will say, I'm traveling from New Jersey to Atlanta. Does anyone have a place to stay on the way? I have X, Y, and Z skills. Could I stay on your farm? I can trade my work for that as well. And so people are working together to say, I want to stay in agriculture. I want to keep farming and working. So let's work together on that. And then I'll feature a few things that are going on globally. In La Via Campesina, who's worked with peasant agriculture or smallholder agriculture, primarily in the global south, to elevate land access issues and broader food sovereignty. They have really put together and started to talk about how LGBTQ equity really is in line with food sovereignty and fits in with food sovereignty as well. And then I'll highlight the UK Gay Farmer Hotline, helpline, which was just featured in the Atlantic, in an Atlantic article. And this was a place where queer farmers and gay farmers in particular, if they felt isolated or if they felt like they needed help, they could call into this farmer operated helpline and get support that way. So we see that queer people are sort of rejecting this displacement from farming by engaging with people on a personal level, at a community level, and then with these broader structures as well. So that brings me to the next topic, which includes a queer lens on agriculture. And so, as we've talked about, queer people have maybe these alternative ways of entering farming, or they have different ways of engaging with it because of barriers and opportunities as well. So what we can take from this is queer as a verb. So some of you may be well familiar with this. It might be new to others of you, but typically we think of queer as an adjective. As our identity in that way. It's describing who we are in that way. But queering, or the process of queering, questions norms, assumptions, and truths that have gone unnoticed. And so typically we think about this in paying specific attention to power and the role of sexuality. You can think about how queer people maybe question norms and assumptions about the family or reproduction or marriage, and these things that are happening in everyday life. But when we apply queering to agriculture, we can see that a queer approach or a queer perspective might show us alternative pathways and visions to organizing farming and family life. And this is really, it's not only for queer people, it's for non-queer people as well, although we should continue to center queer people and other marginalized populations in this way. But it's for queer and non-queer people to challenge the current farming system and enact new types of farming, new farming practices. And so we're going to give some examples of what this queering looks like in practice in agriculture. And I'll start off with queering the family farm. So like Ike mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the USDA categorizes 98% of the farms in the US as family operated. And so what this means in practice is that the principal operator and persons related to the operator own 50% or more of the assets. So this is through marriage, adoption, and blood ties. And what we know is that this is a guiding vision of American agriculture, and that it's viewed as a natural way to farm. So typically when I say the family farm, most people aren't immediately envisioning the picture that I have up on the screen. We have a different idea about what the family farm looks like. And I'll highlight the work of Gabe Rosenberg here, who did a historical analysis of 4-H and USDA in their new book that came out just a few years ago. But Rosenberg finds that the 4-H and USDA during the 1930s promoted the family farm as an economic and biological union between a revenue-producing male farmer and a nurturing farmer's wife. So you can see this is kind of in the American imaginary of what we envision as farming. And we can put on our gender hat and say, obviously women are really subordinated in this position. But a queer lens takes this a step further and allows us to interrogate this whole idea of the family farm. And in particular, that the fact that this is a way to maintain world population through reproduction. And so I want us to challenge a little bit and say, maybe a different way to looking at farming is not only through the family farm to reproduce and have more people in the rural population, but maybe we can queer the family farm and say, what does it look like to promote really diverse and vibrant rural populations in a different way? And also, as Ike pointed out, sustainable agriculture has really assumed that the family farm has ecological benefits regardless of size and practices. And so what's important here to highlight is that the family farm isn't based on farming practices, but rather is based on relationship ties that are typically related to marriage and other very heteronormative institutions as well. So what are we conflating there when we talk about relationships with farming practices? And so I'll just give you one example of a farmer in my sample, Ash, and they explained that in their view, farming feels like a family career. Even though my definitions of family look different than, I think, the American concept of the nuclear family. That is definitely a potential barrier. Being able to actually enact that vision of family in farming spaces, in rural spaces, that might be pretty hostile in many ways. So Ash, as a queer and as a polyamorous farmer, they felt like their vision of farming didn't quite fit what people already had in mind. So they were really interested in an intergenerational aspect and having multiple people on the farm, not only a two-person household. And they were saying, I don't know how to do this, or I don't know how to make it happen, because there's not really the support structures in the same way that we see the family farm. And just to reiterate, we can continue to think about, if we only have one guiding vision of potential farming options or opportunities, what are we missing? What other ways to organize farming and farm life might actually create really vibrant rural communities, ecological sustainability, and other things in that way. So along with the family farm, there's a really key piece of land inheritance. So I'll turn it back over to Ike to talk about sexuality and land justice.
Thanks, Mike. So I want to offer you all an example of how I use a queer theoretical lens on agriculture in one of my particular research projects, which is about how queer farmers access farmland. And what I find in this project is that for all farmers, people's processes of accessing farmland is really enmeshed with accessing these other key resources, which are labor, credit, and knowledge. And these four resources are also what farmer surveys, where farmers say in surveys that these are the farmers' biggest economic challenges and the biggest barriers to farm economic viability. And what I find in this work is that when you use a queer lens on accessing these four resources, we see different ways that sexuality and heteronormativity is embedded in the process of accessing each resource. So I'll give a quick example of how for each one. So for land access, for queer farmers, especially queer farmers of color, folks were oftentimes reluctant to pursue rural land, which is oftentimes the most affordable land. This is something we've mentioned a little bit in this presentation. But I want to offer the example of what Alex told to me, and it's important to keep in mind here that Alex grew up in a rural area and wanted to return to a rural area, but said this: I want to have my own land, but I'm also nervous about what life would be like out in the country. And I don't want to subject my children to any types of cruel forms of bullying or mistreatment. I also don't want my business to struggle for my identity. If people aren't receptive to queer sexuality and queer gender expression, how will that affect my sales as a farmer? So offering now a queer lens on labor and the labor access process, a queer lens reveals that most farmers and all types of farms typically rely on an intimate partner, either for on-farm labor, off-farm income, or having an off-farm job in the US in order to access health insurance. And because queer folks often, like we have fewer numbers, we're often invisible in rural and agricultural spaces, and because of the rural heterosexism and androcentrism that we've been talking about, it can be really difficult to find intimate partners and queer farming partners to live with you rurally. Moving on to credit, a queer lens on credit access reminds us that the USDA has lost some big court battles for discrimination in the loan access process, particularly for African American, Latinx, and Indigenous farmers, also for women farmers. And one example from the women farmers case, I think, is really relevant here, which is that studies have found that in this discrimination, what happened is loan officers didn't read or perceive women as farmers, so we're less likely to give them loans. So I think when we think about for queer farmers, our ability to get loans is tied up to whether or not loan officers and people with in that position of power perceive us as farmers, which is tied up in identity-based things like race and gender and sexuality. And lastly, I'll mention a brief example of a queer lens on agricultural knowledge access, which is that a common way to learn farming is through apprenticeships, which can be really isolating if you're apprenticing and you're queer and you're not on a queer-run farm. And I think it's important to say that without visible queer community in places like apprenticeships or conferences or universities or other places where people learn agriculture, queer potential farmers can start to feel like this profession might not be for them. So what I'm trying to get at in my perspective here is that an underlying problem in accessing all of these four resources is that in our system, economic system today, we let land, labor, credit, and knowledge access happen through markets, through capitalist markets. And because markets don't have any sort of internal ways of ensuring or prioritizing social and ecological values over economic return. So what we see, just economically speaking, is that farmers who prioritize social justice and farmers who prioritize ecological sustainability are put at a structural disadvantage in the marketplace. And what I see here using a queer lens, so this is true for all farmers, but when you use a queer lens on that phenomenon, what you see is that to compensate for market failures, farmers of all types rely on this family farm model and the unpaid work often of intimate partners or of themselves in order to access land, labor, credit, and knowledge. And so for queer folks who can't or don't want to follow these traditional ways of doing family and doing farming, they can be at a disadvantage in accessing these four key resources. At the same time, because queer folks often do family in unique ways, some have come up with alternative strategies for doing farming, some of which we discussed in this last section. So now I'll turn it over to Jack to talk a little bit more about questioning farmland access.
Thank you, Ike. So in this final vein of how can we use a queer lens and queering to help us inform our approaches to agriculture, I want to tie together these pieces that Michaela talked about with the family farm and that Ike talked about with farmland. So when you bring a queer lens to farm families and farmland, it highlights that farmland access in the US post-conquest was concentrated within heterosexual families, white heterosexual families, as a result of displacement, genocide, forced labor, and multiple other forms of racist discrimination. So when you're looking at the heteronormative roots of farming and that contemporary US agriculture was built on racism, you can see that the sexual politics and the racial politics of farming are intimately related. You can't look at sexuality without interrogating race and these racist pasts and ongoing discrimination. So what we're arguing is that if you're going to take a queer lens on farming, it necessitates that we investigate and support more equitable ways of organizing farmland and farm access, namely in the form of reparations. So reparations are actions taken to make amends for a wrongdoing, coupled with an explicit acknowledgement and apology. So in the case of farming, what this may look like is a recognition of injuries, past and ongoing, that are stemming from white bodies stealing land and labor from Indigenous and Black communities, as well as an unfettered apology for those wrongdoings and the dehumanization. It also involves redistribution. So in the case of farm and land access, that will be the redistribution of land and resources for farming. And finally, self-governance. So these would be projects that are organized and led by farmers of color themselves. And Ike earlier mentioned some examples that are maybe quasi reparations, but incomplete. So Ike talked about lawsuits against the USDA for discrimination in the loan process against Black farmers, Indigenous farmers, Latinx farmers, as well as women farmers. But these efforts are incomplete because there was no widespread apology. Not everyone did actually receive the payout, and the governance and process of those payouts were not facilitated by the groups that were harmed or controlled by them. So today we have a couple of examples of what we can look to. I had the privilege this fall at the Midwest Organic Sustainable Education Services, a big organic farming gathering in Wisconsin, to meet with individuals at a queer farmer meetup who organized Divine Natural Ancestry, or DNA. This is a group in the Twin Cities of Minnesota that farms 6 plots around the city. They're practicing natural and indigenous connections to the earth and growing food and medicine. They distribute this food and medicine mostly by bike to people who usually do not have access. And they're sharing education about urban agriculture through hosting events and workshops. And they're overall bringing people together for meals aimed at community building and healing. And part of their explicit mission, this is a group of some queer women of color, non-binary folks, and part of their explicit mission is demanding reparations and demanding that white-bodied people deepen their own understandings of reparations through self-work and healing, and creating a dialogue and opportunities for reparations within their own white communities. We see these conversations going on the East Coast as well. Groundswell this summer was part of a land reconciliation and reparations community potluck to discuss what reparations could look like. And the Northeast Farmers of Color Network is also part of that effort. So there's a map that you can find on Soulfire Farm's website. Soulfire Farm is in New York, and they're working to reclaim sovereignty and calling for reparations so that they can grow nourishing food and distribute it within their communities. So this is a map that's on that website that is of land projects that are led by majority farmers of color. And each one of these locations you can click on and see the specific needs of the farmers in those projects. This type of project by Soulfire and the Northeast Group is part of larger national efforts, largely coordinated by the National Black Food and Justice Alliance. So this map is just one part of that. So what we're arguing here with this queer perspective is that if we were talking about queering agriculture, queering the family farm, and queering land access, if you're interested in that and in sexuality and agriculture, and especially if you are a white-bodied person, it is imperative that we take action steps towards race-based reparation and to support land projects organized by and led by farmers of color.
Thanks. So just to wrap us up, I want to mention how we brought us on a little path today, starting with queer farmers' experiences of oppression, moving on to queer farmers' experiences and strategies of resistance, and then zooming up a little bit and talking about what a queer lens on agriculture can offer more broadly. And I'm looking forward to hearing what you all think on these topics in the discussion.
Great. So we have these discussion questions, and you should have all received them in advance. So I'll turn it over to Groundswell in just a second, and then we can break out into smaller sessions and talk about it. I'll just leave this up here for a minute. I know all of us would be really thrilled if you're a farmer in the region to come to please email us if you have questions, or if you're working in education or extension and outreach and you'd like us to engage in some other way. I know we're all really thrilled, and outreach is what drives all of us to do this work in the first place. So please feel free to reach out to us via email or seek us out in some other way. But we are just thrilled to have this discussion, and I'll put these back up and then I'll stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Groundswell. So thank you all so much for listening, and we're really looking forward to the discussion.
We don't hear you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. That was, oh, wow. My brain is like processing things in a very different way right now, and it's really awesome. And there's some really cool comments here in the chat group as well. One in particular about the relationship between nuclear families and the conventional industrial agricultural system and homogeny and monoculture, and how, you know, a diverse system is necessary for like real growth. And I don't remember who said that, but it was awesome. And then for some of you who have registered in the recent past, I'm going to also copy those questions into the chat box because I sent it to some registrants, I don't know, not in the near recent past. So otherwise, what we will do after I copy those questions into the chat box as well is we'll do breakout groups. And so here at Zoom, I think for those of you who are tuning in on the phone, I'm not sure if those of you who are actually tuning in on the phone can unmute yourself. So I'm going to unmute you in a moment. And then I think with the breakout groups, you get put into automatic groups when you're tuning in via phone. And I'm not sure like how it is on your end. So I just want you all to know that like we haven't forgot about you either. So yeah, let me copy those questions into the chat box. I don't know if you want to share the screen for a moment just so people can see them, because I'm really excited for this conversation. And what we will do is spend about, what time is it, 10? I don't know, about five to 7 minutes or so talking about 1, what does sexuality have to do with agriculture? 2, how might LGBTQIA+ farmers' experiences be similar or different to others in the farming community? 3, how can queer perspectives contribute to sustainability and social justice in agriculture? And so I'm getting these questions now, posting them in the chat box. And then we'll do breakout groups. And then otherwise, while you guys were talking, I was proposing in the chat box, for those of you who didn't see it, to do a little roll call, type in your name, pronouns, where you're from, because it's really awesome to see where everybody is. And I'm like wowed that at least one person is tuned in all the way from California. That's really early in the morning there.
Yeah, Claire.
So thank you. All right, so I put those questions in the chat box, and then we're going to do breakout rooms. And then we're going to have about 5 people per group, and for about 5 to 7 minutes. So I'm looking forward to when we come back as a larger group, and just any questions that came up or cool ideas, we'll have time to share it, have a Q&A before we all kind of head in our different directions. So yeah, I'm doing the breakout groups now. All right. So everybody's being invited into their breakout groups. So for those of you who are there, if you join your groups, that would be great. You can see some of you haven't. If you choose not to, that's fine too. You don't have to. Let's see, so I'm gonna go into this one.
From Rocksteady Farm in New York.
Oh, amazing.
Maggie.
I've heard of you.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi. I'm from Toronto in Canada. And I'm from a food justice organization called Food Share. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Alexis from Groundswell Center.
Hey there, my name is Ange. I run a project called They Keep Bees, which is a queer beekeeping project in Western Massachusetts and Southern Florida.
Amazing. I think I follow you on Instagram.
Awesome, thank you.
That's awesome.
Okay. So what does sexuality have to do with agriculture? People have thoughts on this?
Honestly, like when I think about sexuality and agriculture, I, especially like with my little bit of experience with seed saving, honestly, I always think about plants and their reproductive nature, and just like how vibrant and fluid it is.
Mm-hmm.
And like how necessary it is to have so many different ways to be able to create life. And that's just kind of like where I'm at. I'm just like, guys, this is so obvious.
Yeah, when we think about, when we get connected more deeply with nature and like are looking at the, the sex organs of different plants and all sorts of things, it's just so clear that there's nothing straight about nature. Nature is inherently queer and thrives in its own diversity. And the fact that we somehow managed to do the opposite in farming culture, even though that's connected to nature, just seems so counterintuitive to what it is showing to us when we're actually deeply involved in it. And if anything, people who are connected to the land should understand queerness more, not less.
Yeah.
Yeah, it almost feels like something that the family farmer has been willfully ignoring for so long, right? Like the sustainable agriculture movement has been willfully ignoring, and it feels like a fractured relationship with land and the natural world to be that willfully ignoring the level of queerness that exists in the natural world.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else have thoughts on that first question?
I mean, I think, yeah, it has to do with everything. It's kind of like a broad question to me. So, I mean, inherently agriculture is like connected to humans. And I think that, you know, there's such a diversity in humans. So to separate the two doesn't make sense to me. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people are also becoming more and more interested in concepts of sacred sexuality and connecting themselves back to their own bodies, which means connecting to the land in order to heighten their own sexual experiences within their own bodies and their own sexual practices. And a lot of people are linking our disconnect from land to our disconnect from our deeper spiritual and sexual selves. And so even though that's not necessarily farming, it is our bodies in connection to land and sexuality. And I think there's a piece there as well that people are starting to understand and get curious about and have practices around.
Cool.
So maybe we can go to the next question or the third question. I don't know if we want to take a vote on which question.
I like number 3.
Me too. How can queer perspectives contribute to sustainability and social justice in agriculture?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the workshop we just listened to did a nice job of talking about that, but yeah, just in terms of, if we think about queerness as innovation, if we think about queer people as people who have had to actively reject social norms that don't work for them and that don't make sense and don't ring true. If those types of folks get to have a say in how we innovate this industry and how we connect with a deeper truth about nature, about as these people are also connecting to a deeper truth about themselves or ourselves. I guess I can only speak for myself as a queer woman, but I think there's something really powerful about community people who have actively had to choose who they want to be in the face of not having those options presented to them.
I also think there's a certain resiliency to queer people that in like times of climate change is particularly important, you know, like just resiliency and problem solving and collaboration and like times of struggle and looking to other movements like of people who have also been marginalized. I think there's just this like inherent like strength that we have to tackle really hard shit, and that's really important right now.
I was going to say something kind of similar in the sense that I feel like the queer perspective is very fluid. And as far as intersections, I feel like that there's a perspective that's able to see in so many different directions almost that can help bridge a lot of gaps between different peoples, because it's such a fluid intersection that really has it goes way deeper than what people actually see. I don't know how else to like better say it. I think that's so valuable. And then like I know for me, for like coming from like the indigenous perspective, like for us, like the people who identify as queer and as two-sided have always been acknowledged to already have like a really deep connection with nature that's really respected and seen as sacred. And for us to like have perspective is actually like a really necessary thing in the community in order for like the balance to be maintained. So I mean, I believe that, and I like live by that, and so I feel really strongly that like in even the non-Indigenous community, that plays a role with everybody, you know.
That resonates with me a lot. I feel like when I visit and engage with queer land or natural projects, what I notice is a more thoughtful perspective on the relationship rather than the dominance of the land, like not trying to subjugate the land into producing agriculture, but thinking more about how to be in a relationship that is generative for both the land and the people that are on it.
I also wanted to add to this is just like because of that connection queers have to cities, because of you know what we talked about in the beginning of this, is like that's a real advantage to kind of like the work that we can do to bridge rural and urban and feeding like populations and connecting, and there's just like such a vibrancy that cities have that then can come to urban spaces, and the connection to nature that is in rural spaces come to urban, you know. So I feel like there's a great power in that.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm going to close out the breakout room so that we have enough time to like have Q&A and any other conversation to happen amongst all of us. I feel like I could sit here and talk about this stuff all day.
Thank you.
But thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have 60 seconds.
That person, the trans woman in the presentation. Yeah. So I wouldn't, knowing what I know after all these years, I wouldn't. I'm very happy I made the decision I did, but I also think with the right support, I could have, I could have made it work in other parts of the country as well.
Cool. Nice.
Yeah, good luck on
all going back to the main meeting.
Yeah, it sounds like they want to. I guess I'll just wait and see when they take us, unless there's something we're supposed to do.
Thank you.
Nice talking with you, Marissa.
You too.
I wish you well.
Thank you. You as well.
Let's see.
Hello, everybody. This is Alexis from Groundswell. I closed the breakout rooms. I think everybody that's here should be now back in the main room. And let me see. Do we have Ike and Mick and Jack here?
This is Ike, I'm here.
Sweet.
Jack is here. I don't know if that went through or not.
Yeah.
Michaela's here too.
Awesome. Hey. So thank you. I hope everybody's breakout group, it felt like a really short conversation. Just like the tip of the iceberg, I hope everybody was able to make nice connections and start really nice conversations with each other. And so we have about 15 minutes left for today's discussion. And I just wanted to open it up to like a general Q&A. So either you can speak out or type in the chat box, whatever you want to do is more comfortable for you. Or if you just have, an idea or a thought that came up in your discussion that you wanted to bring up that's all right as well. But I just wanted to make sure that we also all had time to come back and have a discussion as a whole as well, even though there's 41 of us here right now. So yeah, just make sure if you want to speak to unmute yourself, and otherwise, if you're not going to speak, to mute yourself.
I have a question. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
My name's Liz. I'm actually also work at Groundswell, but I was wondering if this, I guess this feels like a group of a lot of queer farmers and some people who probably don't identify as queer farmers, but I wondered if there's a way to contact this group as a whole after the chat.
That's a good question.
One
Jack
thing
and
that,
Hannah have the listserv. Oh, sorry, Jack.
yes, that I was going to offer that. So Hannah, who is on the call, I think Hannah Breckbill, who is in Iowa and the person who organizes and hosts the Queer Farmer Convergence. There's a listserv, the Queer Farmer Network, that I can post the link to sign up for that. And I add people. I usually check about every 2 to 4 weeks and add people to that list. And I mentioned on my breakout call that there's about 300, more than 300 people on that listserv right now, largely US, some people internationally as well. There's also the Northeast Queer Farmer Alliance listserv that I believe Ike is one of the people that can add emails for, but either Ike or Mick or Maggie, who I think is still on the call, can probably speak better to that.
Yeah, so if you're a queer farmer in the Northeast, that's an option, that listserv. But also if neither of those fit for your situation or you're not quite sure, feel free to email me. And there are some more visible, more public, and some more underground groups as well. And we could discuss different options.
I just wanted to add, this is Maggie from Rocksteady, is I put a link in a survey for the Northeast Queer Farmer Alliance. We're trying to get a little more information about next steps with that alliance. So if you're interested and you live in the Northeast, please click that survey. That'd be awesome. Thanks.
Hi, this is Ruth Ann and Marie. We're down here in Nashville, Tennessee. And I don't really have a question, but I just do want to say how excited I am to be a part of this discussion group. We have both just been sitting here just practically in tears because I think we've both been really hungry for conversation like this, especially down here in the South. So we are just really encouraged and hope to use this inspiration to build more queer farmer and agricultural community down here. So just wanted to say thank you.
I want to say thank you to the two of you. You were in the little boxes that I could see, and I was loving the enthusiastic celebrations and the picture taking and the, fist bump stuff.
Yeah, it definitely got me. It kept me going, energized.
Yeah, we're doing it.
It's also really cold we're in our office trailer. We work for a landscaping company, so it's freezing in here, so we're trying to stay. But I'm glad.
Maggie just put up the link to the Queer Farmer Northeast spreadsheet. Maggie, can you say that again?
It's a survey we're just trying to get a little more information of where to take the alliance.
So Maggie just posted that. Thank you, Maggie. And I just posted the link to Hannah Breckbill's page of Humble Hands Harvest that has all the information about the Queer Farmer Convergence and sublinks. One of those sublinks is the next thing that I posted that is the sign up for the Queer Farmer Network listserv. And then I also posted a resource page that I have on my website that's not by any ways complete, but does have some books, some movies, the names of some of these organizations, other publications that might be a nice starter. There's also the link, as Leo just posted, to the 2020 Queer Farmer Convergence calendar that you can pre-order now.
I wanted to just say, this is like not really a question either, but just being so touched by the three of y'all's work. I wanted to do something very similar with my thesis, and it went in a very different direction, mainly because I was working with two straight people who weren't in my field and didn't understand the importance of me understanding and working with my identity in an academic setting. And so it's just been like really, really just so much. I met Jack actually in person this summer at a convergence, so that's how I know all about all of it. And it's just been really touching to know all of you and hear all of your voices, and yeah.
I want to respond to that really quickly and just say thank you so much for sharing that, and please do reach out for any reason if you want to, and also reflecting a little bit on like at least my experience in doing this research in the academy it's been a really mixed bag. Some folks have been like a small handful of folks have really understood and have been my rock, and a lot of other folks it's been really a difficult process explaining why this is important research. And then also just want to appreciate Mick and Jack to have two other folks at a similar point in our academic lives doing similar work has really kept me motivated, because sometimes it's not easy.
This is Jessica in Florida. I have a question for everyone. I'm interested in knowing what successes other educators have had supporting in the community, at the community level, like non-traditional farmers, and also, like from the farmer side, what do you think that somebody in an educational status can do to really bring forward other non-traditional farmers? And I'm, you know, a gay wannabe farmer, but I'm currently doing education, so.
I have some quick ideas. If I understood the question, I think it's about like what on the community or local level, like sort of actions can we take?
Yeah.
So a couple examples or things that are just coming to mind right now in no particular order. But one in my hometown of Brattleboro, Vermont is the organization Out in the Open. And they do an annual, I forget the name of it exactly, but it's basically a community work day on a queer farm in the local area. Which can be a really amazing way, like one, to help, for instance, a farmer like we did plant an acre of potatoes. And on the other hand, and probably more importantly, to get the local queer community together, especially folks who are interested in farming. Like for those gatherings, a lot of times folks who are just thinking about stepping into it, like that's their point for meeting other folks who are interested. Another thing that I haven't seen yet, but I think is really important and has come up in the interviews a lot that I think is really low-hanging fruit is for organizations that have like that do farm apprenticeships or internships to have a system simply where mentor farmers can list themselves as LGBTQ or LGBTQ plus friendly, just so that because like folks in the interviews talk so much about having a queer mentor farmer was so important for them, and it can be really difficult to find those folks. So those are two small examples.
Thanks.
I'll chime in a little bit here. So I work primarily for the Pennsylvania Women's Agriculture Network. And so they have really, you know, they help me recruit people, and they put out my call for participants. So it's great to have, you know, they're not a queer specific organization, but they were willing to let me, you know, go through that network. And the Pennsylvania Sustainable Agriculture Association helped me organize a panel at their conference, which was the first time in the 30-year history of this conference that there was any discussion on LGBTQ equity. And it went so well that HASA is having an informal mixer the next year for queer farmers and allies at that conference. So I think like we can have the formal you know, presentations like this and other ways. And then we can also have informal gatherings at conferences that just say, let's show some visibility and support so that it's not all on individual farmers to build relationships to get support as well. So I think those informal and formal meetings and gatherings are really important for farmers to see each other.
Well, unfortunately, we're in our last 5 minutes, and I hate to stop the discussion. Excuse me. But there was a few comments in the chat box. Hawthorne McCracken says, they have been looking into perennial crops and permaculture, which they think hold promises, but the concept of degrowth is important. And it's hard to envision owning land without exclusively focusing on making money. And I just wanted to read that because I think it's an amazing comment. And then I think somebody's question was addressed. There was an announcement that Claire Reisman, if you're going out to Eagle Farm in California in January, she'll be doing a session on queer visions of a sustainable future at the conference there. And yeah, land trusts. I think in March, I'm hoping that we will be having another Farming for Justice discussion. Well, we'll be having one approximately every month. But in March, we're hoping that the topic will be on land trusts because this is coming up a lot in conversation, and there's so many different types of ways to protect land. And I think some land trusts are really kind of stepping up to the plate as being open to different types of conservation easements. And so I know that's a really hot topic, and I would love to keep going on that. Then also I'm going to post a link in the chat box. Please, everybody, if you could fill out this evaluation, it helps our programs so much. It just takes 5 minutes. We use it. That's where we get our funding from. So I'll send it in the email box. Also, somebody was asking, earlier Liz was asking about how to kind of keep this community going as far as the conversation goes. And I remember one of you has the ability to share or add people to the listservs. So I have that down in my notes, but what I will do is I will send an email out to everybody that has attended this conversation and registered for it with all of the resources that have been shared throughout the conversation in the chat box. And then any other resources that our panelists would like to share as well as a follow-up. And then I will also add the video recording link to this webinar because it has been recorded. We'll be able to share the conversation with each other. And I'm just really grateful for this today and all of the amazing conversations that happened. And it's so inspiring. I mean, personally, my personal comment about all of this is agriculture is, I mean, inherently sexual because things need to reproduce. So the conversation that needs to happen, and nothing's black and white when it comes to plants. So we're just part of that. So thank you, Ike, Mick, Jack, for holding this conversation and all of the work that you're doing. Yeah, thank you, everybody. And if you three have any last words, now is the time.
I just want to say thank you all so much for tuning in. It really, this is absolutely the best part of research and school, is getting to see all of you and getting to talk with all of you. And I just feel so really privileged to be here, and really so excited to see all of you as farmers and educators out there doing this tough on the ground work. And I just hope that I can, and we can help facilitate the work that you all do in the future. So thank you all so much, and please feel free to reach out if I can help anyone.
Yes.
Just echoing what Mick said, I really appreciate you all being here. Feel free to reach out for any reason. If my email address isn't immediately available, you can Google my name in Queer Farms and it'll come up right away. And I just really appreciate the time and space.
Everything that Mick and Ike said, please be in touch. You all are fabulous and wonderful and gorgeous human beings doing amazing work. And I'm just stupid overjoyed. And please, please, please be in touch. Thank you for all that you do. And thank you to Groundswell for hosting and making this platform possible for all of us to be here today.
Yeah. Thank you all for being here. And then, yeah, in that email that I'll send out, I'll make sure to also share emails as well. So if you guys want to stay in touch, yes, lovely. So everybody have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for contributing to the conversation. Thank you for listening. And hopefully we'll see you next month or in the future. So have a wonderful day, everybody, and thank you.